Hello, everyone. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to give this talk. It's a pleasure to be here at UCL for the first time. Today, I'm going to be talking about some work that I did with Ian Walker, my supervisor, Ben Blocker, on causality matters in medical imaging. So, as we all know, there's been tremendous progress in machine learning-based medical image analysis lately, mostly fueled by deep learning nowadays, and we've.
Is the volume okay? Or do we use the microphone?
Can everyone hear me at the back?
I think you should use the mic.
All right.
Just take one of the really nice.
The other thing is that bear in mind the recording from here is
Yeah, so
try not to go to the laptop.
hello. All right, is it better now? Yeah, okay. So, we've seen incredible progress in accuracy for tasks like disease classification or semantic segmentation, even approaching human levels of accuracy. Now, the problem is that we don't always see these successes translated into wider clinical practice. And we think that this is mainly because of these two big challenges. First of all, is data scarcity. We just don't have enough label data to represent the real data we'll find in practice. And the second one is data mismatch, which is basically the data is not representative. The data we do have is not representative of the test data. And we argue here in this work that causality can help us better understand these challenges and basically, in a more systematic way, reason about ways to counteract them and get better models in the end. So first of all, a brief background. I presume not all of you are familiar with causality theory. So just very briefly, we say that A is a direct cause of B. If we are manipulating the values of A, we can change the likelihood of B if we hold everything else constant. So you can think about it as B being some function of A, potentially also of noise and other variables, but changing A may change B. And important consequence of this is what's called the principle of independence of cause and mechanism, that says that the distribution of the cause does not influence or inform in any way the distribution of the effect given the cause, so the mechanism. That's what we call it. And if we have more than two variables, we can extend this to basically what's called the causal diagram, which is a graph that encodes all of the causal influences between the variables. And this basically embodies what's called the causal Markov assumption, which just says that the joint distribution over all variables factorizes as a product of these conditionals, which are the mechanisms. Now, this is all very general, but what does it actually mean in the context of medical images? So here we're in the situation where we want to predict some form of annotation, Y, from the images X. So here we'll be talking about supervised learning. Right, so what this means is that we want to fit a statistical model to estimate P of Y given X, given some suitable loss function for the application. Right, and it's important to know what causes what, and we'll see later that this has important impacts on what learning strategies are suitable. For example, if semi-supervised learning could work, or if we should prefer generative or discriminative models. Right, so we can have either causal or anti-causal prediction. So causal prediction is just we're trying to predict the effect from the cause. So we see that the arrows are pointing in the same direction. And anti-causal, we're predicting the cause from the effect. And in order to be able to discern which one is which, we need to have a look at the metadata. So the meta information that comes with the data set. So not just the images and whatever labels or annotations you have, but we also need to have information about how this data was collected, how was it generated, and how was it selected, and so on. So all things like what the application is, what was the purpose of the data when it was collected, and so on. All of this can give us very important information about not only the causal direction, but also can give us clues about whether this data is actually representative of the data we'll encounter when the model is deployed. So we'll illustrate this discussion with two examples. First of them is for skin lesion classification. Here we are given a bunch of dermoscopic images, which is basically just these optical images zoomed in on moles, basically on pigmented skin lesions. And we want to find out, is this malignant? Like, is it some sort of melanoma or other sort of malignant conditions. And we are given also these labels Y that come from biopsy. So these are considered gold standard for the true presence of cancer. Now, we can consider these labels basically the best we can get. So we can say that these labels are causing the visual appearance of these lesions in the images. So we can write Y causes X, like that. And this is a case of anti-causal prediction, if you remember from the previous slide. Here at the top, you can see that the arrow of causation from disease to image is the opposite direction of the prediction. And the second example that we're going to discuss is for brain tumor segmentation. So here we collect structural brain MRI, so let's say T1, T2, FLAIR, and so on, from a cohort of glioma patients. And when we then ask a team of radiologists to do manual contouring of these lesions. So something like that. Now, if you picture this process, the images were acquired before these segmentations were done, and they are done visually on top of the images. So actually, if you imagine that we do some manipulation in the image digitally, this could alter the segmentation masks, right? So this is clearly a case of causal prediction. So the images cause the segmentation and not the other way around. And in addition, we'll talk more about this later. Imagine that this data was collected for research purposes on high-resolution 3 Tesla scanner, let's say in the university, and the cohort is mostly majoritarily adult. And then this model would be deployed for clinical practice with a conventional 1.5 Tesla in a hospital. So this already tells us that there might be issues of data mismatch later on. So we'll talk about it later. So let's discuss the first challenge, which is data scarcity. And I'm going to talk a bit more in detail about two strategies that people often adopt to counteract data scarcity, which are semi-supervision and data augmentation. So first of all, just a reminder, semi-supervision is the hope of using unlabeled data to improve a predictor that we would have trained just with labeled data. And we do this because often labeled data is much smaller than whatever unlabeled data we can find. And of course, there's a key requirement for this is that labeled data actually helps, right? Otherwise, it would be pointless. So in more technical terms, this usually formulated in terms of these assumptions, which all say the input distribution P of X must be relevant for the prediction P of Y given X, right? Otherwise, it makes no sense to collect more data to have a better picture of P of X. Now, if you think back on that principle of independence of cause and mechanism that I mentioned before, when X causes Y, so for causal prediction, then P of X should be completely uninformative with respect to P of Y given X. So in theory, SSL is pointless for causal prediction tasks. And as we saw in the example just now, semantic segmentation is a case of causal prediction. So it is possible that SSL does not help for semantic segmentation. I know that this might be a bit controversial, and but this is just what the theory says. We haven't done any experiments to actually verify this, but it's just something to keep in mind. And the second strategy we'd like to talk about is data augmentation. So we're all familiar with this. We're just generating additional label data. So if we don't have enough label data, we're just generating more of it. And we do this by just applying some, let's say, realistic perturbations that we expect to find in the test data. And these augmentations, depending on the task you have and the types of augmentations, that can be encouraging to different things. So either invariance, so sometimes we want our predictor to be insensitive to certain kinds of variation. So we hold the target Y fixed, and we apply some transformations on X. So what this does is actually gives us a better idea of what P of X given Y is, but with a fixed P of Y. And equivariance means that we're altering both the images and the prediction targets in the same way. So, for example, for segmentation or for tasks of localization, for example, we want to transform the pixel coordinates in a consistent way between the two. So this gives us a better idea of the spatial structure of the joint distribution P of X, Y. Now, if we think back on semi-supervision, the main difference here is that we are getting more information about the joint P of xy, whereas for semi-supervision, it's just P of x. And what this means is that data augmentation is probably more suitable for both causal and anti-causal tasks, whereas without the theoretical limitation of semi-supervision for causal tasks. And actually, there's a recent trend of work on trying to actually learn these augmentations using unlabeled data. So maybe this can deliver on the promises of semi-supervision while just improving on the, let's say, the reliability of data augmentation. Now, the second challenge was data mismatch. So basically, any differences between your training and test data. And here we argue that there are two distinct mechanisms that produce these, and we're going to have a look at them from a causal lens. So first of all, let's think about dataset shift. So what this is that when the training and the test data are different because of external causes. So think of, let's say, for example, if just the populations between, let's say, the training hospital and the test hospital are just different, right? Or if we're using inconsistent acquisition protocols between these two sites, right? And depending on the causal structure, and we're going to see a bit more about it later, we can actually identify several different types of dataset shift with different properties and different potential solutions. And some of them are even, let's say, open problems still, we don't know exactly how we could fix them. So here, just a quick, coming back to that brain imaging example, remember that the training data was collected on a high resolution 3 Tesla scanner, so we can expect that the 1.5 Tesla scanner for testing will give different quality images. And also we had a difference in the age distributions, right? So we had a majority adults in the training data, and this can give all sorts of variations in the actual anatomy. Right, so we can expect differences in head size, or the appearance of the lesions, or even the prevalences of different types of tumors that we know that exist. Right, so in the diagram here on the right, we can see that the image causes the segmentation, as we saw, the manual annotation process, but then also that indicator variable that training versus test domain causes the variations in the presence of the disease and the actual appearance of the images. And here, just some little cartoons to kind of illustrate some of these cases. And here, I won't go into too much detail. It's just to give you a taster of the different kinds of let's say, familiar types of shift that we could identify if we take into account the causal structure. So if we imagine this unobserved true anatomy, which is what we're trying to actually have a look at, we can think that X is like this noisy measurement of this Z, which is what we're interested in. And we also consider this additional domain indicator. So now, depending on whether the domain influences each of those conditional distributions there, we can identify these different cases and think about potential solutions to each of them individually. And the second mechanism of data mismatch that I'd like to talk about is sample selection. So here in this case, we have just the one population, but it just happens that your training samples are collected based on some biased selection process, which is sample dependent. So we say that the training distribution there is P of xy, but conditioned on having been selected, right? And then in the test time, we have no restrictions. So you can think about it as some sort of biased subsampling procedure. And as I said, this is data dependent. So the main difference between sample selection and dataset shift is the direction of causation here. So it's not an external change, but actually it's dependent on the data. So if you see here on the bottom cartoon, for example, you see the arrow going into the selection indicator. And again, depending on the causal dependencies there, we can identify different cases of sample selection, which have their own implications and potential solutions. And coming back to that skin lesion example, we think in this case, we suppose that the biopsy is only done when there's suspicion. So if a dermatologist will look at the image and say like, oh, this looks a bit dodgy, let's go and have further tests to confirm the diagnosis. Right, so this is clearly a case of the image influencing whether the data is collected or not. So just to wrap up now, the take-home messages from this work are that thinking in terms of causality can help us better understand these processes that generate differences between our training and test data, help us more systematically think about potential solutions. And these causal diagrams, so just thinking about the causal relationship, writing them down, gives us a language to clearly communicate our assumptions, and anyone reading your work will be able to clearly understand what your assumptions are, and then validate whether they make sense or not. And finally, just as I teased before, it's possible that semi-supervision doesn't quite work for semantic segmentation. It's possible, so some people working on complexity theory actually show that you can get some benefits from semi-supervision in a regime of finite data. So you can get things like improved convergence rates and so on, but ultimately there may be no fundamental benefits. And the recommendation we like to make here is that think about the causal story of the data. Don't look just at images and labels. Think about where does this data come from? Where does it? Why did it come to be like this? And this can help us better understand what problems our models may face. So, if you'd like to know more, and I had to do a very, let's say, brief overview of all of it, but we'll go a lot more in detail in our paper that's submitted to me, Kai. And if you'd like to have a look at the manuscript, please ask for it in my email.